speaker today. The topic of today's seminar is George Washington. We'll be paying particular attention to the precedents set for use of executive power by George Washington during his first term in office. And leading us through this discussion will be Dr. William Allen, Emeritus Professor of Political Philosophy and Emeritus Dean of James Madison College at Michigan State University. Professor Allen is a distinguished scholar and teacher with numerous publications, including, among others, a book entitled George Washington, America's First Progressive, and an edited volume of George Washington's writings entitled George Washington, A Collection. We're delighted to have Professor Allen with us here today. Professor Allen, I'm going to turn the seminar over to you now.
Good morning to you all, and thank you, Dr. Ross. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to spend this time speaking with our participants about George Washington and the precedents that initiated government under the Constitution. I am going to, let's see, I need to get the ball first, pardon me for a moment for pausing, but I don't know that I can share my desktop at the moment unless I receive the ball. Okay, now we have it. Very good. Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Now we can continue. What you see on the screen will mean nothing to you, but we'll get to that in a moment. I want to say at the outset that it is my intention to take us through this with an emphasis on the conversation and recognizing, therefore, that what we have is effectively a walking tour, I would call it, through the first 8 years under the new Constitution. And in this walking tour, George Washington is our guide. He's going to give us a bird's eye view of what the main issues were at the foundation of the government and the ways in which those issues were handled from his perspective. Now, there are some questions that I should respond to immediately concerning this, and questions that would involve our being able to deal with the very serious issue of whether, in fact, George Washington is a reliable witness. There are many ways in which we might say, according to certain scholars at least, that Washington was perhaps a symbol rather than a source of creative energy at the founding and in the administration of the government. There are at least some who maintain that what transpired during Washington's administration was that he was rather guided by his aides, the Alexander Hamiltons, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, than himself guiding in the formation of policy. One of the reasons for focusing on George Washington and focusing on his presidential addresses, as we're going to do this morning, is precisely to see the error in that view and to come to know a George Washington who not only understood what he was about and where he wished to take the country, but who had the capacity to express himself. The first place we're going to look in order to appreciate that capacity, and I'm going to do this only briefly, and I'm not going to spend the time talking through in monologues all of the readings that you have now read, but I want to focus on this discarded first inaugural address at the outset so we get some appreciation for what we can expect from George Washington. After I've done that, then we will take the walking tour through the presidential addresses, seeing the government proceed from the inauguration in New York all the way to a period when we begin the construction of the national capital, and George Washington finally gives his farewell. In that process, I want to hear from you. I want, therefore, to be able to have you raise your hands. I want to be able to call on you. I might call on you at random. I'm sure, having read the materials, there are questions all of you have, and it's very important to me that each of you should be able to get the questions in your mind answered to the extent possible in the time that we have. So let me just bring you to confront, for the moment, this discarded first inaugural address. It's discarded for good reason, as you will see in reading through it. And you will have recognized from the head note to this particular title in the George Washington collection that the work had to be reassembled because the address that was initially prepared as an inaugural address by George Washington was never delivered. That's why it's discarded. It was not delivered because for whatever reason, and we don't know the precise reason George Washington eventually made the decision that it was inappropriate. We may speculate why it was inappropriate, but one of the things that I have often considered to be probably prominent in the reasons for rejecting this approach was its very focused first-person statement. It consists primarily of George Washington declaring himself, who he was, and what his objectives were as he set out to take on the task of leading the country. As we see his addresses written after this, including the inaugural address that was originally delivered in place of this discarded inaugural, Washington tended to prefer the third person, not the first person. He tended not to take credit. He tended to deprecate himself, to, as it were, downplay his own abilities and accomplishments, and rather to give prominence to the work that was being done by his associates in the government and by the people themselves, so that it is entirely possible that this first inaugural was in fact discarded because it was moving in a different direction. It was, as I said, first person singular to an excessive degree in terms of George Washington's history and character. It's also the case that those who have looked at this have imagined that it was not George Washington's work. It was said to be David Humphrey's work. The initial draft was in the hand of David Humphreys himself. And David Humphreys himself also subsequently delivered a commencement address or an address at Yale, in which a great deal of the part of this text appeared in Humphrey's address. There's no question Humphrey, as Washington's secretary, played a role in helping to construct this. But one of the interesting things that we observe as we walk through this discarded inaugural address and make an analysis of it is that a great portion of it, well more than 50%, reflects comments from Washington's own correspondence and addresses of the prior years, reaching back at least to 1783, at the time of the publication of Washington's circular address to the governors of the 13 states. So that the ideas of Washington's is very clear. That is a very clear idea. That the actual expressions are often Washington is also clear because these are very much quotations. So what then do we find in the discarded inaugural? Well, let me say to begin with that this is not the way it would appear to us because we don't have the manuscript. It may be close. What I have done in producing the document was to take little fragments, and each of these separate passages or paragraphs is such a fragment. So you may take a look from the very beginning to see that what we collected were many scraps of paper, literally unorganized. And the first attempt at organizing them was very unsuccessful. What, therefore, was necessary was to read with an eye to trying to make logical connections from one expression to the next. For example, the very first, "We are this day assembled on a solemn and important occasion," obviously identifies itself as the opening of an address, and therefore has pride of place to begin this. Without going through all those decisions and how they were made, I simply want you to appreciate that it was a work of reconstruction that produces this. Now, I'm pulling it up to you this morning because I want to focus on one thing, rather than the overall scholarship of reproducing the address or the question of who was the actual author of it. And that's this fragment 18. This is one in which George Washington begins to speak very directly about his judgment. And we begin to get a sense of how he was planning to undertake the government of the United States as he took office. At some point, he said he would not be in the position to set up his own judgment as a standard of perfection. You can see the opening sentence, which is actually a question. And so he's responding, well, who's to judge? And where do I stand in relationship to what the meaning of this government is and how it's proposed to operate? Let me just read briefly from this. And shall I arrogantly pronounce that whosoever differs from me must discern the subject through a distorting medium or be influenced by some nefarious design? The mind is so formed in different persons as to contemplate the same object from different points of view. Hence originates the difference on questions of the greatest import, both human and divine. In all institutions of the former kind, great allowances are doubtless to be made for the fallibility and imperfection of their authors. Although the agency I had in forming this system and the high opinion I entertained of my colleagues for their ability and integrity may have tended to walk by judgment in its favor, yet I will not pretend to say that it appears absolutely perfect to me, or that there may not be many faults which have escaped my discernment. I will only say that during and since the session of the convention, I have attentively heard and read every oral and printed information on both sides of the question that could be procured. This long and laborious investigation, which I endeavored as far as the frailty of nature would permit, to act with candor, has resulted in a fixed belief that this Constitution is really in its formation a government of the people. That is to say, a government in which all power is derived from and at stated periods reverts to them, and that in its operation it is purely a government of laws and executed by the fair substitutes of the people alone. The election of the different branches of Congress by the freemen, either directly or indirectly, is the pivot on which turns the first wheel of the government, a wheel which communicates motion to all the rest. And then he continues in that vein, as you can see, praising the construction of the government and laying out what he thinks to be the barriers against potential tyrannies that are built into the constitutional framework. Then going further on down to, I'll use the cursor to show you where I am in the read now here, where it says secondly. Secondly, because no other or greater powers appear to me to be delegated to this government that are essential to accomplish the objects for which it was instituted, to wit, the safety and happiness of the governed. And thirdly, because it is clear to my conception that no government before introduced among mankind ever contained so many checks and such efficacious restraints to prevent it from degenerating into any species of oppression. It is unnecessary to be insisted upon, because it is well known that the impotence of Congress in the former Confederation and the inexpediency of trusting more ample prerogatives to a simple body gave birth to different branches which constitute the present government. Convinced as I am that the balances arising from the distribution of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers are the best that have been instituted, I presume now to assert that better may not still be devised. Now, this is an extraordinary statement, isn't it? It says we have the best that has been instituted, and he will assert that better may not still be devised. He presumes now, upon judgment, after long and laborious study, to assert that better may not still be devised. The statement is qualified. It means in this context, it means given these resources, these participants, these opportunities, the very best that could be done has been done. Now, in earlier transcriptions of this fragment, that term, I presume now to assert, has been transcribed as not by many of the commentators. But in my reading of the manuscript, and I have produced all this from the manuscript, I must tell you, the term really is now, it was misread previously, and we can see evidence of that in fragment 24, if I remember correctly. Let me just go down to this, where there's another occasion where now has been misread as a not. Yes, fragment 24 it is. At the very beginning there, you will see it says, we are now to take upon ourselves the conduct of that government. That was also in the earlier transcription misread as a not. But clearly he did not mean to say we are not to take upon ourselves the conduct of that government, when that is the very thing that he was doing. So that comparing the manuscripts in those two places makes very clear that the earlier statement is, I presume now to assert that better still may not be devised. In this regard, then, what we're looking at in this discarded inaugural is George Washington expressing himself comprehensively as to the question of the value of the constitutional design. and providing an overall view of it which reflects a kind of thinking that is in fact complete in terms of his ability to assess, we might say, I'm trying to stop the sharing for the moment, and I'm not being successful, that's why I'm diverted. But he was trying to assess the work of the convention and trying to establish what it was that the expectations were for it. Now, as we take our walking tour, that's what I want us to be paying attention to. There's a great deal more in the Discarded Inaugural, which I trust you have read, and I want you to be able to assess it on your own, but rather than taking you literally through the documents, which would make this a very long morning indeed, I'm simply going to refer to some things and then ask you to give your input with respect to specific questions that have arisen in your mind. You should even now be contemplating using the hand signal to raise your hand at any time. You don't have to wait for a pause. I would like us, I know that there are many of us here, and it's not easy to have a conversation with as many, but we have someone who's paying attention, who's monitoring, and the minute you use the hand signal, it will be identified and communicated to me, and we will call upon you, so that I may be interrupted at any time, and I may stop myself and call on you at random. So as we're going through this introduction, be focusing your mind on the questions that you want to ask. And it doesn't have to be confined, if you happen to be called at random, to the issue we're presently discussing. Let me therefore continue before going into the later presidential addresses to say just a couple of more things about the Discarded Inaugural Address. George Washington, in drafting this address, was looking to the question apparently of what tone to set for the new government. And the most impressive thing about it is the tone he wanted to set was a tone of ambitious projection. He wanted to project goals of the kinds of accomplishments that would characterize the nation. We will observe that he's not narrowly focused on policy questions. We will get some reference to that. It is clear, for example, that he understands how urgent it is to deal with the question of national debt, which was the legacy of the war. We often hear today people refer to the most recent wars in the United States as the first wars in our history that we did not pay for, but rather went into debt to pay. They are mistaken when they make that observation. The Revolutionary War was the first war we didn't pay for, produced an astounding debt, which was, of course, similar to the situation in which the country finds itself now. So George Washington does refer to that, but he's not mainly focused on policy. He's focused on the question of what kind of people are we to be? And so what we want to be able to ask ourselves is, since he didn't deliver this address, was he able to sustain that focus in the address he did deliver and the addresses that followed, at the same time of how did he identify the political issues that characterize the opening of the government under the Constitution. Fragment 28 in the Discarded Inaugural is one of those which will give you some idea of this, where he says, in speaking, and he writes this as speaking to the members of Congress primarily, I trust you will not fail to use your best endeavors to improve the education and manners of a people, to accelerate the progress of arts and sciences, to patronize works of genius, to confer rewards for inventions of utility, and to cherish institutions favorable to humanity. Now, if you pull out your constitutions at this moment and go to Article 1, you will see towards the end that among the very things included are precisely the powers to provide for encouragement of arts, inventions, etc. Washington is giving his gloss on what that means. These dry passages in the Constitution are actually rich with possibilities as we conceive the work of the government to be to lead the country into an advanced stage of civilization, taking education seriously, taking the development of manners seriously, taking the progress of the arts and sciences seriously. All this is present from the beginning in George Washington's mind. We also find in this discussion Washington being particularly careful to call for a very specific thing, but it's not a policy question, namely establishing postcodes in the postal service. Why? Because he wants to be able to distribute the newspapers without charge. So that from the beginning, this idea of constructing a society that has a progressively ameliorating influence on the manners and the talents of the society is clearly expressed by George Washington. It's an idea that he gave voice to in the 1780s when he was still, in fact, commander of the army. It's an idea that has constantly characterized his approach to governing in the United States. We will go a step further, and you will see in fragment 34, a passage I'm going to share with you, and then I'm going to be done with the discarded inaugural. But you may ask questions about it. He says there something that seems particular and policy focused, but what I want you to focus on is what lies beneath it. And this is well into that fragment, which is one of the longer fragments we were able to recover. He says in the third paragraph, it remains for you to make out of a country poor in the precious metals and comparatively thin of inhabitants, a flourishing state. In short, what Washington has done here is to say, we're starting from almost, not quite, primitive conditions. There was an artist in the 19th century, around 1830, who produced a series called, I forget the precise title, but something like the Development of Civilization, a series of paintings. There are 4 of them. And so they take from the idea of human society from the savage state through the full flourishing of civilization to the ultimate decline and destruction. An extraordinarily and impressive set of paintings by a man named Thomas Cole. Well, this is what Washington is describing here, and we can find other passages not unlike this that explain it. But let's listen to this for a moment. But here it is particularly incumbent on me to express my idea of a flourishing state. You see, when I say he emphasized the first person, it's extraordinary for Washington to say, I have an idea. He more characteristically and self-deprecatingly would have deferred to other people's ideas. He would have insinuated his ideas rather than proclaimed them. And this is another evidence of why this address wasn't delivered. He said, my idea of a flourishing state I want to communicate with precision and to distinguish between happiness and splendor. The people of this country may doubtless enjoy all the great blessings of the social state, and yet United America may not, for a long time to come, make a brilliant figure as a nation among the nations of the earth. Should this be the case, and should the people be actuated by principles of true magnanimity, they will not suffer their ambition to be awakened. So he starts out by saying we want to have a flourishing state, but it begins by not being overambitious, being patient, taking our time, developing our manners, developing our morals, growing gradually into the strength of national purpose that would come with a graduated rather than an excess ambition. He continues, should this be the case, should the people be actuated by principles of true magnanimity, and should the people be, they will not suffer their ambition to be awakened. They should guard against ambition as against their greatest enemy. We should not, in imitation of some nations which have been celebrated for a false kind of patriotism, wish to aggrandize our own republic at the expense of the freedom and happiness of the rest of mankind. The prospect that the American will not act upon so narrow a scale affords the most comfortable reflections to a benevolent mind, as their remoteness from other nations in a manner precludes them from foreign quarrels. So their extent of territory and gradual settlement will enable them to maintain something like a war of posts against the invasion of luxury, dissipation, and corruption. For after the larger cities and old establishments on the borders of the Atlantic shall, in the progress of time, have fallen a prey to those invaders, the Western states will probably long retain their primeval simplicity of manners and incorruptible love of liberty. May we not reasonably expect that by those manners and this patriotism, uncommon prosperity will be entailed on the civil institutions of the American world, And may you not console yourselves for any irksome circumstances which shall occur in the performance of your task, with the pleasing consideration that you are now employed in laying the foundation of that durable prosperity. So what do we see? We see in this extraordinary statement a vision extending through time, extending beyond the time of his own lifetime, in which the country develops, which it is expanding continentally, because the vision calls for that. We're going to have a decaying Atlantic seaboard while we have a still aborning Western territory. We're going to see this shaping the entire culture in such a way that it remains moderate, magnanimous, humane, that it looks upon the rest of the world not as objects of conquest, but as friends to be won through the very prosperity of the United States itself. In short, the vision enunciated in the discarded inaugural is indeed the vision that George Washington had. This is the foundation for calling him America's first progressive. But we will be patient and careful to observe that this is a progressivism which is sustained by the virtues of the people as he presents it here. It is not a managed progressivism. It is not what happened at the turn of the 20th century. It is the consequence and outcome of a people favored by circumstances which will afford them opportunity to put their best foot forward. And so Washington continues to praise that. Now, as I said, we don't deliver the discarded inaugural address. We have to put it aside and ask ourselves then, if we look at the first inaugural, the actual inaugural address, how does it differ? In what ways is it a different kind of expression than what we saw in the discarded inaugural address? Now, I'm hopeful that someone has an answer for that ready. I'm not yet at the point of making a random call and asking people the direct question, but I'm close. But if you already have an answer, I certainly ask you to raise your hand and to present it to us at this time. But meanwhile, while you're thinking about that, I want you to take a look at that first inaugural address. Ponder its relatively brief expression, the character it assumes, and the role that it plays in setting a certain kind of tone and tenor to the presidency in the United States, which has for a long time had a prevalent influence on that office. Not always. There have been a few of our presidents who did not respect this third-person attitude that Washington ultimately ended up adopting. And there have been a few who expressed rather greater confidence in themselves than in their people. But in general, the tone Washington set is the tone that has been prevalent. And we can see this, and I will share with you, if you're wondering about that question I just asked, how does the first inaugural differ? In what way is it something distinct from the discarded inaugural? I want to share with you an exchange that George Washington had with James Madison at the very time this is all taking place, i.e. the inaugural is being delivered, the discarded inaugural is being set aside. He wrote a letter to Madison on May the 5th. And that letter read as follows. I'm not going to read the whole letter to you, just to say, he says, "So I could wish you to finish the good work in a short reply to the address of the House of Representatives, which I now enclose, that there may be an accordance in the business." And what's that a reference to? Madison had helped draft the first inaugural. Madison had, in fact, drafted the response to the first inaugural from the House of Representatives. And so now Washington is turning to Madison to say, I need to answer the response that was sent to me, so would you draft that too? So, as he put it, there will be an accordance in the whole business. Then in the last paragraph of that letter, he makes this observation. As the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent, it is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents may be fixed on true principles. So what is the letter to Madison saying? It is saying that George Washington, initiating the government, drafting these addresses, choosing which to deliver, the manner in which to deliver them, self-consciously is modeling the office of president. He has enlisted James Madison's help because we are creating precedents, and we want them to be founded on true principles. What are those true principles? They are the principles of republicanism as Washington is laying them out over the course of his remarks in the actually delivered inaugural, and I'm going to suggest to you, consistent with what he meant to say originally in the discarded inaugural. But I'm still asking you to answer that question for me. In what way does the discarded inaugural differ from the inaugural that was actually presented? I wonder if I have any takers. I think we have one, Mr. Evans. Can we get Mr. Evans? I'm not certain we're the moderator. Can I be heard?
Oh, hello.
There we are. Good. Go right ahead, sir.
All right. Well, I was looking at this. By the article establishing the executive department, it is made the duty of the president to recommend your consideration of such measure as he shall judge necessary and expedient. And he goes on basically to say that he's not going to get too deeply into what his opinion is.
Yeah.
He's going to defer to them, but he would hope they'd be guided by virtue and not factional passion or whatever.
Yeah, excellent observation. He very explicitly says, I'm not going to give you my idea, you give me your ideas. And he expresses confidence in that. Ann Hester had a comment to add. Let's go there. Go right ahead.
I think in addition to what Mr. Evans said, the first inaugural speech shows a very specific modesty on the part of Washington.
Yes.
He claims to be one man who, if working by himself, would be so completely snowed by the immensity of the task to build this nation,
Yes.
that he, as driven by duty as he is, would be absolutely and completely, in his mind, incompetent to do it.
Yes.
So I think what he's doing in the first inaugural is he's really setting a tone of the president is one man, and therefore I am asking you as Congress to bring together your best, your brightest, to help those that are also just one man, and show basically the country, by all of us working together to make the country great, that it is everyone's duty and everyone's part and everyone's responsibility to take our example to heart and work together to make this nation as great as we can make it now.
I cannot do more to underscore what you've just said. It is precisely the case that that's what Washington is doing, and that, along with the deference to the Congress, represents the distinction that is present between the two addresses. He initially thought of going in one direction and rejected it to adopt this other direction as a matter of precedent, to underscore that it is not going to be the work of the president that makes or preserves the country. Now, the president plays a critical role, and of course, the first address, the discarded inaugural, suggests that he knew that it was a critical role. But we shall see as we look through all of these documents, and particularly conclude with the farewell address, that it became also important for George Washington to underscore the people's strength and ability, and not to use the position of president or executive to crowd out self-confidence and responsibility on the part of the people. So there was a tension that he recognized. And when he got rid of the one address and used instead the second address, he was making clear that this founding was going to turn on how well we could empower the people. And the people can't be empowered if we have powerful figures claiming to do everything and understand everything. So this is not simply an expression of modesty, though it is modesty, but it is more a deliberate attempt to foster an empowerment in the people themselves. This leads me to make another observation about George Washington, which is not generally well understood. For many years, Washington, as I said at the outset, has been discounted as an intellectual contributor to the founding. I think that you can see, even in the discarded inaugural, which are just fragments, that the intellectual substance was there, it was present. But why was he always put down? Why was he always thought to be secondary, intellectually speaking, rather than one of the sources of ideas? The primary reason is George Washington himself. The second thought he had about the inaugural address, turning from one to the other, is actually a return to a first thought, if we go all the way back to 1775, where he is selected as commander of the Army of the United States. His acceptance of the role was a speech in which he completely denied the ability to do the job. What he said was, "You've chosen me, and it's my duty to accept. But I have to tell you, I don't think I'm up to this task. So don't blame me if I can't do it. Just know I'm going to put my best into it. I'm going to give it everything I've got." And it was that pattern of self-deprecation that characterized his career from the outset of the Revolutionary War, and he sustained through his presidency. But it is also important to remember that when the Continental Congress sat down to deliberate responding militarily to Great Britain, one person and one person alone showed up at the meeting in the Congress dressed in full military regalia, and that was George Washington. So at the same time that he disclaims a claim of ability, he puts himself forward. He identifies himself as a candidate, which means he knows what he's doing, right? The two things go together. They're not in conflict. He knows where he wants to go. He knows what he wants to do. He knows what the country needs. But he also recognizes that you can't accomplish it if you don't leave room for the people to participate in giving direction to the country. So the extraordinary precedental value of this is to say that much the way Abraham Lincoln did in certain contexts, when one thinks about it, that a chief executive has the role of protecting the people's opportunity to claim credit for the salvation of the country. And that's what George Washington is doing in the first inaugural address. Now, there's some details in that address that I want you to talk about, too. One of them, of course, is the expression that he uses when he is describing the foundations of the country. Let me just refer you to a passage in the textbook at page 462, in which he says, at the very top of that page, it's a continuing paragraph from the previous page, where shall we start? So on another. I'm starting in the middle of a sentence, I apologize for that. That the foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, and the preeminence of free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world. So, the foundation is private morality. Individuals themselves must place themselves in a position to be able to produce public happiness. Over on page 464 in the text, he repeats it at the bottom of that page. We feel, sir, the force and acknowledge the justness of the observation. This is the response to him that comes in from the Senate, that the foundation of our national policy should be laid in private morality. If individuals be not influenced by moral principles, it is in vain to look for public virtue. It is therefore the duty of legislators to enforce both by precept and example. So at the outset of the government, we're setting a tone. We're actually raising an issue here. What's the role of virtue in republicanism? And then when we say virtue, do we distinguish between private virtue or private morality, as here expressed, and imposed public virtue or public morality? What's the process? How does it work? Is it the legislators who by law impose virtue on people, or it is the virtue of the people that sets the tone for the community? What do we think? Go right ahead. Ellie Nick? Yes.
Yes, I want to back up to a comment. I'm sorry that I was having trouble communicating.
Oh, sorry.
When Washington appeared in uniform to the Continental Congress, one thing we discussed in our American history class, was he sending a message that this was perhaps a call to arms when there were a number of those who were attending who were still attempting to establish some kind of reconciliation with the British Crown? And was he making a statement by that military address that they may be called to arms instead of necessarily putting himself forward as commander?
Certainly, I think it's fair to say, to respond directly to that question, that Washington affirmed the necessity of a call to arms. We know Washington was the first person 10 years before that time to acknowledge that it may be necessary to take up arms. So long before the Boston Massacre, Lexington and Concord, or any of those things, George Washington, just responding to the various measures of Congress, which is to say the measures of Parliament, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, and such things, was already acknowledging to George Mason and ultimately to his own wife's uncle in England that we would be forced to take up arms unless Britain relented. So that he was ready in 1775 to say again, this is the time to think about arms, seems perfectly clear and perfectly understandable. Now, does that mean that he didn't want to, as it were, volunteer to be commander? I have to think it doesn't mean that. I think those two things are compatible, not incompatible. I think to show up at the Congress where the decision is to be made about going to war in uniform presupposes that one understands if you decide to go to war, you must organize your forces and you must identify a commander. So therefore, I would say Washington in that regard probably both wanted to emphasize the likelihood of the need for war and also to make himself available. But that doesn't undercut his statement that he may not succeed. You might call that kind of self-deprecation a cautionary approach to the job. I'll take the job, but I want to protect myself on the downside against any way or form of having to be accountable for not being fully up to it by telling you in advance that I recognize I might not be quite the person you need. But if I'm the person you've got, you can't find another, and so be it. That's what I would say. Now, to go on, and Kate Catone has asked the question, what does Washington mean by private morality? And I would like you to respond to that question, or at least to think about it for a little bit, rather than simply to give an answer to it. And so I'm going to ask you, Ms. Catone, if you would just muse about that for a moment.
Well, I didn't understand exactly what he meant by public morality. It seems to me that he discusses sort of Republican virtues of moderation in the previous passage that you discussed. But I don't know that that's what he means. So I was really hoping you'd just tell me what the heck does he mean.
Well, let's go back to the passage briefly. Let's just talk together about this. He says, I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. Now there he clearly means virtue, you see. So public morality has something to do with virtue. Virtue has something to do with personal rectitude. Those things we know. He continues, between duty and advantage. So we know it has to do with duty. It has to do with how one pursues self-interest. That's what advantage addresses. He continues, between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the policy towards the public prosperity and felicity. So apparently, magnanimity, honesty, duty, virtue, all these things are involved in private morality. So basically, is he not describing a fundamental decency as the foundation of national happiness? The foundation of our national policy?
Yes, I see that. And do we think about that at all anymore?
Well, I'm going to invite everyone to comment on that and think about that. Let me rephrase your question, if I might.
Please.
Does anyone ask us to think that way anymore?
I don't know. It seems to me that politicians at election time sometimes bring up those issues, but as a general rule, no, which is probably why I'm asking the question in the first place.
Right. Well, let's see what Erica Ninneman says about that. She's answered no. Are you there? I can't get a response from Erica. Oh, I don't have a mic. Sorry about that. All right, very good. Then we will ask Rosemary Holodak. Can you? You don't have a mic either, or do you? I can't tell. Let's see. Do you have a mic, Ms. Holodak? Nope, you don't have a mic. Sorry. Well, at least we have these responses. And let me read to you. You've all seen it perhaps, but let's just read what Rosemary Holodak said. Private morality seems to mean that citizens have a responsibility to strive on their own and to be successful through their own merits and hard work. Now, I think it must mean at least that, right? We can say that's the basic minimum. But here's the issue. A connection has been made between private morality and public happiness. The connection, we can understand if a connection is made between private morality and private happiness, if we think that the individual who lives a good, decent, and industrious life will be happy. But does it require the major portion of the community living such lives in order for a nation to be happy? Is there such a thing as public happiness? Because what he's saying is national policy must be based on this private industriousness, this private virtue, this private morality. The question was asked, are we ever asked to think this way any longer? And the answer seems to be no in general, though you might find an occasional office holder who will say, I think you should. Mr. Evans is making an observation that he asked in his class students to write him the question of can man govern themselves? And he says their thoughts on the matter were interesting, so perhaps he would share some of that with us. Mr. Evans, if you could grab the mic.
Yes, yeah, I got the mic now.
Great.
Yeah, we're going over Federalist 1, 10, and 51, I mean, to a certain extent in my AP government class. So I asked from, Alexander Hamilton's question, do men govern themselves through deliberation or thoughtfulness, or is it all accident or force? And a lot of the kids had negative viewpoints on it, but in other words, they thought that there had to be some law and order or force, that people couldn't do it themselves, or they weren't thoughtful enough, or they didn't pay enough attention. But they didn't seem to really expound on that. That just seemed to be their one idea, and then they moved away from it. And I don't think, in general, at least in high school, and maybe to a certain extent in college, and certainly not in society by the politicians in most cases, any side, are we asked to think that way. It's more we're asked to believe certain things and then act on those beliefs in a partisanship way.
Very good. Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and it's a big problem that we're going to have to struggle with. Let's ask Tony Williams to jump in here because he has an interesting observation to make. Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I think what he's saying is that in order for self-government to be possible, that each man needs to literally govern himself and be virtuous and follow the path to a truly happy life. If we simply follow our passions if we follow that which is corrupt, then we're going to end up with a corrupt society, and in that sense, that self-government will collapse. And so, and Washington will later make this point in the farewell. That is the basis of virtual morality. Virtual morality is the basis for self-government. And so, our personal virtue and happiness there later on leads in that paragraph to a just self-governing republic rooted on right principles.
Yeah, so basically what we're focusing on is that the emphasis on self-government, and call it virtue, call it morality, call it whatever you want, basically the term self-government encompasses all of that, is not a procedural emphasis. It's not a question of how communities decide issues, whether by majority vote or otherwise. It's the question of what the character of the people is. And to say that that is a precondition for living the Republican life, for living the democratic life of self-government, is a very differing way of thinking about the question than we often employ in contemporary discussions of these matters. So it is really, I think, of some value for us to say that the question of self-government, and we're looking at Washington specifically now, as understood by those who originated it, was a question that imposed fairly heavy obligations on citizens, namely to govern themselves, as Mr. Williams suggested. But notice this counterpart. Here's this counterpart. They can do it. It's not simply that they're being asked to govern themselves. There's an affirmation being made about their humanity, that they can govern themselves. Because we must never forget that throughout most of human history up until that very moment, the most intelligent people didn't believe most people could govern themselves. They actually thought people needed to be governed. That therefore the notion of self-government was inappropriate. Let's ask Mr. Kersey to jump in here because he's been waiting for a bit.
Yes, my question is that do you think that Washington is putting himself forward as an example of private virtue, of private morality, as an example of somebody who he himself can do this? He can. He's an example of the perfect citizen in a republic.
I'm tempted. I wonder if anybody else is. That makes sense to me. He doesn't only model the administration of the government, but he also models the personal integrity, the personal discipline that he's recommending as self-government, as private morality. Well, the point, of course, is that all of these things, this is an inaugural address. Let's not forget that. This is not a sermon. This is setting the government in motion. He's addressing himself to the Congress. He's going to address the question of the issues they should be concerned with. This is part and parcel of setting an agenda, a political agenda. But the agenda is made subordinate to the overall goal of the kind of society we wish to create. Now, Mr. Schaefer has asked, is this a utopian ideal? Is this a way to, how do we say, does this run counter? Well, why don't you tell us yourself, Mr. Schaefer? Can you grab the mic, or can someone pass it to you? Or do you have a mic? Yes, you do. Go ahead, Mr. Schaefer. Why don't you state it yourself?
Well, I haven't fully thought of the whole thought here, but it seems to me when I read documents, the government documents, the Constitution things, seems to be sort of a utopian ideology at work here, that this is where we want people to be, this is where people should be. How do we get people there? Mm-hmm. But on the same token, I think many parts of the Constitution are sort of written so that we're protecting the government from the very people that we're governing, that reactionary, that maybe they're not ready to govern themselves.
Yes, it is not anything eccentric that you would say that, because let's be candid. Scholarship on the question going back even before Gordon Wood's creation of the American Republic, has all suggested that the Constitution was a counter-revolutionary move, a counter-democratic move. Whether you're looking at the Jensen thesis or the early Wood thesis, in terms of our historical scholarship, that would be the lesson you would learn. However, I must point out that many of us since that time have shown the error in that way of thinking, and shown that, in fact, not only was the Beardian thesis about property owners writing the Constitution incorrect, because properties of every sort were distributed on both sides of the question pretty fairly and evenly, but it completely ignored the fundamental character of the Declaration of Independence, in which the original affirmation of the potential and the capability of the people to self-government is made, which is what all men are created equal actually means. So that to think of the government as, or the Constitution, as a way of protecting the government from the people, is to overemphasize the single expression that James Madison makes in Federalist number 63, when he indicates that people are alienated from the direct exercise of political authority in their collective capacity. He's talking about their collective capacity. They're not alienated as individuals, and that's why in Federalist 37 through 39, we place the emphasis on responsibility, where what we're looking for is to see the representatives respond to the people, held to account by the people. And then finally, we make very clear in Federalist 61, the manner of governing is such that through the auxiliary precautions, we will in fact enable a majority to rule while restraining it from becoming a faction. So the protection of government is not from the people, but only from factions. And we have an elaborate process to accomplish that. That is at least the argument that they make. And it seems to me we have to take those arguments seriously. Now, that doesn't answer the question whether this is the utopian ideal, though, does it? You see, we still have to face that, because these are extraordinary things to say about human beings. George Washington said it already in 1783, so it's not new now. He said it in the circular address. He made clear that we no longer live in the age of ignorance and superstition. We are now enlightened, he told us. And the opportunity has been given to the people to vindicate their claim that they're capable of self-government. That's what he said in 1783. So that he would now, in the inaugural address, in effect repeat that, should not be a surprise to us. He doesn't regard it as utopian. At the same time that we can say he doesn't regard it as certain, because he understands that the people who have the opportunity to prove themselves can also fail. And that's the thing that makes it not utopian. There's not a historical necessity to this. We don't simply adopt the Constitution and all live happily ever after. It's then a constant work. And that's what's being said in the first inaugural. Here is a work imposed upon the people, a constant work. And the work starts not with any law, but starts with their internalizing the demands of virtue, of private morality. Now, I'm going to harp on this just 1 second more, then we're coming back to questions, okay? Here's the point in our time. Today, our strongest defense of American democracy is the defense of indifference. We think the democratic order is supposed to encompass everything, the virtuous and the non-virtuous, the religious and the atheist, the disciplined and the indisciplined. Our idea of equal protection of the laws is not making any distinctions based on people's character. And so what we're really looking at is that the founding, that was not the orientation. There, the orientation was character makes the difference. And you cannot make a flourishing republic if you don't have a people of character sufficient to sustain the republic. Now, your questions are fast and furious, and I don't have easy ways to identify she's where in line, but Trish Langdon has been waiting, so I'm going to call on her.
Hello?
Yes,
Can you hear me?
can hear you.
Yes, my comment is, I think to ask people about virtue or to talk about virtue in a society that believes in the survival of the fittest, that you have to prove that you are fit, that you have to be successful, often at the expense of others, doesn't value virtue. They value getting ahead. And I see this so much in my students, that they believe that this is the truth, that this is how people have always lived, that it's not it wasn't manufactured in the 19th century. So it's very difficult for them to even think about virtue. How does that play into their lives?
Wow, you're all asking such very good questions. I don't know how we're possibly going to get through this morning, but let's try. I mean, connected with your question is Mr. Schaefer's greatest question: can one legislate character? Here's the underlying argument that Washington is making. And you respond to Washington is what I'm going to ask you to do. He's suggesting to us that no, it's not merely a question of people finding themselves in a dog-eat-dog world, survival of the fittest. And it's not a question of imposing decency on people. Instead, he's claiming people can be decent. And when they are, they can live decent lives. And so you wouldn't be making them virtuous. They, because of their virtue, would be making a decent society. That's the argument Washington's making, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that argument would also then answer the question about whether it's a dog-eat-dog world. Because the decency he's talking about, the moderation, the magnanimity, the sense of justice, all these things are just the opposite of dog-eat-dog. Honesty is the best policy, says he in the farewell address, right? So, but the argument he wants us to make is an argument about human nature. It's not an argument about our contemporary opinion, but what are human beings capable of? And that's an affirmation a society has to make at the beginning. If a society isn't based on expectation of human capabilities that are of the highest order, then nobody can expect that society actually to attain to that level of accomplishment. That's the point that's being made. We tend to think government is producing character today, or tries to produce character. Or we tend to think that unless there's an authority in position to impose on people decency, there will not be decency, because actually we tend to believe that human character is by nature indecent.
Yeah. That
it's Thomas Hobbes' state of nature is the war of all against all. That we've tended to accept that. But the question is, did the founders accept it? Or were they making a different kind of argument? That's the point I'm emphasizing right now. Now, we're going to have continuing questions. I see there was someone else in line, and so, but that's Ms. Holodak, but you don't have a mic, so we'll have to take yours in writing when you get to it. Oh, there it is. Regarding Bill Obama's comments, I agree we seem to have forgotten that ideal of a republic of virtue that our founders are aspiring to. Right, yes, okay, so I concur with that. But I want us to remember now, we've got all the rest of the addresses, right? We've read them, and they all do things. I'm going to get out of the first inaugural, but not without first pointing to you that what Washington does, besides deferring to the Congress, is to hit upon a couple of high notes. One of them being, of course, the need to amend the Constitution in terms of adding a Bill of Rights to it. This was in the discarded inaugural. It's in the first inaugural. He makes very clear that we must hold faith to the people who ratified the Constitution on the expectation of a Bill of Rights, and he wants the Congress to proceed to implement that. Now let's go into the first annual message. The government's been up and running for a while. He says, I'm happy to congratulate you that things look good. It's going well for us. And there are many areas in which we think our performance is, of course, to be applaud it. There are other areas in which we need to show some attention. But this is the State of the Union is what we're talking about, right? It used to be called the annual address. It came subsequently to be called the State of the Union address. As you read through that, anything strike you? You see anything there that would cause you to question about the nature of the precedents being established in the administration? I see. We have no one who's going to bite that one. Let me ask you to look at something. Look at that passage, 469 in the text. If you can get the page numbers, if you're doing it online, that may be a little tricky, but it's not very far in. Page and a half. Nor am I less persuaded that you will agree with me in opinion there's nothing which can better deserve our patronage, your patronage, than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is, in every country, the surest basis of public happiness. In one in which the measures of government receive their impression so immediately from the scene of the community as in ours, it is proportionably essential. What that means, government receiving their impression immediately from the sense of the community, is that it's a democratic government. That's what he's saying. It's the people's opinion drives it. To the security of a free constitution, it contributes in various ways by convincing those who are entrusted with the public administration that every valuable end of government is best answered by the enlightened confidence of the people, and by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights, to discern and provide against invasions of them, etc., etc. So, my question. Washington keeps coming back to this theme about education. Why? What's its role in what he's doing, particularly at the beginning of the government? Why does he harp on the notion of science and literature and knowledge so much as he does? Does anyone have an idea about that? Ms. Patron, is that you?
Yes, I do. I have a question about the idea of improvement in that day.
Yes,
that education had to do with improvement, and that people were. Education was essential to improving the human mind, so that science and literature could. That idea of enlightenment, that word you used, that we could be an enlightened people, that took education, and science and literature was part of that, as well as other things too. Education was essential for people to become an improved people. Then, however, when we had an imposed education, a public education system, I don't see that it's working.
Mm-hmm. So that Washington is seeing this, you say, as a means to the end that we all are committed to.
It creates the process of an enlightened people.
Right. Now, he, of course, as I say, he keeps coming back to this even in the farewell address you're there. So he never abandons the idea. He's always encouraging us to embrace measures and institutions of public education. Or education in general, let me say, rather than public education, because I don't want to confuse it with the contemporary usage of the term. And then finally even proposes building a national university. This is so important to him. Now, as an activity of government under the Constitution, how does it strike us that this first president seemed to have such a broad notion of the powers of government? I don't know who's next up, moderator, but I can see there are several people pending it, so if you could help me.
Yes, it looks like Ann Hester has her hand raised.
Okay, great. Ms. Hester, go right ahead.
Well, it would seem to me by looking at page 468 of the text, Washington's very quick to point out that a free people ought not to be armed, or not only to be armed, but disciplined. And I think within that realm is where education comes in, and the emphasis on art and literature. because oftentimes it does take a great amount of personal discipline in order for one to become educated. It's not completely focused. And through his interactions with, for example, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, Washington himself saw the importance of education as it pertains to the improvement of the individual, but also of the contribution of the educated individual to society. And as such, by fostering the idea of education within America, he realized that an educated, disciplined people would eventually, either within his own lifetime or even beyond that, keep his United States really strong and protected from threats from both without and within.
Very good. Mr. Evans.
Yes, my comment may seem strange at first, but I've always thought, or at least over the last couple of years, I've thought that really before they take American history, they should take what they call ancient history in my school. Because if they took that first, they'd understand American history a lot better. And the problem that I have is explaining it to them. I mean, things like this public virtue and such, to kids who really don't know what they mean when they make all these references or anything. Because he's worried about what happened in Athens, what happened in Rome, Syracuse, different places, and the lessons that they took from that. And that's what he means by an education or promoting the science and arts. If we're constantly being educated, we'll be vigilant towards our rights, we'll be citizens, not just subjects, and we'll be virtuous and have private morality and public virtue.
Yeah, excellent. There was someone else there. Let's see where it go.
Like Jason Nelson is our next questioner.
Okay, good. Yeah, go ahead, Jason Nelson.
I was probably just playing. Can you hear me?
It's breaking up, but I can hear you.
I was playing off of what he said in that if the public is going to begin the wheel of government turning, then the public has to be able to make good decisions. And if they're not educated, then their decisions could lead back to tyranny because they could be easily swayed by lesser men.
Okay. And?
Looks like Tony Williams has his hand up as well.
Okay, go right ahead, sir.
What I was going to say is continuing from the idea that a self-government must have virtuous citizens, on 469, Washington tells us the importance of education in developing private morality and virtue, because he goes on to say from where you read before that it gives us the ability to distinguish between oppression and lawful authority. It gives us the ability to discriminate between liberty and license. In other words, it gives us the ability to discriminate between that which is good and that which is evil. And so the idea is that this private virtue is essential to the success of Republican self-government, in the same way that he'll also later state that religion is necessary too. But education for Washington is vitally important.
Okay, very good. Now, I know there's probably someone else in line, but let's just pause for a moment to let me make an observation. It's not only this question, of course, that we have about education in general, but also education specifically in the context of what's taking place under this government. So looking at it in the setting of a State of the Union address, we might consider the question, is this part and parcel of the whole list of topics laid out? I mean, remember, as we go through the address, he's concerned about relations with the Indian tribes. He's concerned about developing a militia, armed and disciplined, as was said to us a moment ago. He's concerned that we are perhaps not as prompt as we need to be in dealing with our relations with foreign nations, and also providing a rule of naturalization. And he mentions, of course, the necessity to get a system of currency weighted measures up and running. He's all talking to Congress, things you need to do, Congress. And they include provisions for advancing agriculture, commerce, and manufacturers. In other words, there's a global view public needs in the government. And so when we get to education within that global view, the question then becomes for us how far education is the way of advancing beyond what it is that is otherwise being called for. I can't tell what's going on. Pardon me for a moment. I was just distracted by my screen, but that's okay. So what I was trying to say is that we have the other issues that Congress has to pay attention to, and the education issue. Is education interactive with the other issues? Is education in support of the other things, or is it one in a list of policy or interest areas as you conceive it? Now, I've lost my list of presenters for reasons. Oh, here it is. Okay. Yes, just as the chat got large. And we have the screen up, but I have no one pending. So, okay, let me answer the question then myself. Put it this way. Looking at the first State of the Union address, we see George Washington setting out a general agenda. And what's the precedent? The precedent is that it is important for the president to identify the issues pending before the country. Then we see him turn specifically to the House of Representatives dealing with appropriation measures, and particularly to the Senate for advising consent measures of the Senate and the House where they would be acting together. His approach is one that says, what we want to do is identify in each session the most immediate concerns that will advance the country along the directions that are important to us. And this is, remember, 1789. So the government's only been in existence for 8 to 9 months, and therefore it has done nothing more than organize itself. So what he's really saying is, now that you're organized, here's your agenda. Now when you turn to the second annual message, you begin to wonder, okay, is it this point where we begin to assess? Is this evaluation? Is this the time to measure how well we're doing? You will get some of that. But you will also get a continuation of what he said before. But here's what begins to interestingly emerge. Namely, Washington doesn't hesitate to say when things are not going well. Now, you're going to find, for example, that as we talked about Indian tribes in the first message, we will do every message for 8 years, and things are going to go up and down. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He says when things look poorly, and he says when things are going well. And it's also interesting that what he does is to identify who we might call the troublemakers. And they're not the Indian tribes exclusively. They're also the people who are impinging upon the Indian tribes and causing difficulties for the country as a whole. In short, Washington's position throughout all of these annual addresses is that of being the person who presents the news, good or bad, when the time for evaluation comes. That's the precedent that he seems to want to establish for his office. Now, he's also reporting on what he has done. But you will notice the way he does that is to say, we are giving you the documents that describe what's happened out on the frontier with respect to the wars with the Indians, or what's happening in foreign negotiations, etc. So that the State of the Union address itself is an overview. It's an evaluation, and it's a measure of how far we need to ratchet up any policy undertakings that have been begun. Now, most of you probably know in the first couple of years, the issues that were primary were not necessarily the issues that have been identified in Washington's agenda. There were issues of a national bank, issues of the debt and the assumption of state debts from the war, issues of the location of the national capital, issues of support for manufacturers in 1792. When we get to the next address, we're getting close to that at least, when Alexander Hamilton presents that report on manufacturers. And of course, the excise tax, which will lead us in a couple of years to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion. So the issues on the table for the Congress are the issues that have specific names and create specific urgencies. But as it pertains to what is taking place with the State of the Union addresses, the president is still focusing on trying to emphasize how far is possible for us to achieve ultimate objectives. When he reflects, for example, on the situation in Europe in the second address on page 472, he says, the disturbed situation of Europe, and particularly the critical posture of the great maritime powers losses, ought to make us the more thankful for the general peace and security enjoyed by the United States, reminds us at the same time of the circumspection with which it becomes us to preserve these blessings. We don't need to read the rest of that because you see where this is headed. Very soon we're going to be dealing with the proclamation of neutrality in 1793 as a direct outcome of wondering, will the French Revolution succeed or fail? So Washington, through these annual messages, is giving us a thermometer reading on how policy is developing in the first years of the government. In the background of all the crises you're familiar with, we know already by 1791 the beginning of party disputes is present. He doesn't refer to them in these messages. He doesn't talk about the fact that his Secretary of the Treasury and James Madison over in the House of Representatives are beginning to write essays in opposition to one another, so that we can see the politics of the nation is beginning to take on a certain character and form, which is not necessarily reflected in the annual messages as they're coming forward. In short, Washington isn't addressing the politics. He's addressing the policies. And that's really important to underscore. He set a precedent for the executive, at least initially, standing above the partisan disputes as far as it is possible to do. Now, when we come to the annual address in 1794, and when he takes specific note of the self-created democratic societies, which he blames for the Whiskey Rebellion, we get a specific reference which some at the time took as partisan. We can discuss whether we think it actually was partisan or not. And it may be that from Washington's perspective, that was not partisan. That was just a matter of having to underscore what it meant to defend the rule of law under the Constitution and therefore recall the names of those who threatened it. But it is also the case that what is going on in terms of these earlier messages is that George Washington is making very clear that he will stand above the emerging partisanship and would expect the president to continue to do so. Let me ask you now, let's pause. Having seen that, as I said, this is a walking tour. Do you see any progressive developments in these presidential addresses? I'd like to see if anyone can give me a comment about that. Is there progressive development in the presidential addresses? Is there any one issue that you can identify that runs through them?
Professor Allen, one thing that that has been coming up in the chat window has been a focus on education and the kind of knowledge and the kind of character that citizens ought to have. So perhaps one theme that we might expound on is the way in which this theme continues through Washington's presidential addresses, and maybe even the way in which his comments and public statements as president are designed in some way to educate the citizenry.
Very good. Let's see that. I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm happier still if I can find someone who wants to address it.
And we do have some comments in the chat window about policy issues that President Washington had emphasized. in his addresses. Eric Ninneman mentions cooperation. Stephen Lynch mentions the establishment of an army. Jason Nelson mentions relations with Native American tribes and also the
okay, very
establishment of
good.
credit.
There we are. Yes. Wonderful.
Todd Miller mentions, along with Stephen Lynch, the protection and preservation of American territory.
Okay, I hadn't gotten to that because it's rather difficult sometimes to do all the scrolling while still paying attention to the presentation. But now that I see that I did get answers, just not hands raised. I was looking for hands raised. Let me just take up some of those because this is what I was trying to work to. And I think this also affects us with regard to the question of education as a consistent theme. The point is, looking at these issues, going all the way from education down through the urging of cooperation among the differing groups. His pitching for establishing a regular military, frankly. There was some slowness in getting that developed. And as issues and threats seemed to be more to loom on the horizon, then he would raise, of course, the tempo of his remarks in that regard. But that credit one is a huge issue, which we need to pay attention to the way it's being handled. George Washington, from the beginning, of course, has observed the heavy debt that was left over from the Revolutionary War. And so he asked Congress to provide for it. But consistently, he asked for Congress to authorize loans so that it can be managed, but also to get the country moving towards a position where it can extinguish the debt. And so the whole approach is to constantly push in the direction of saying, let us eliminate, retire the debt. After we go back to the beginning, the first inaugural, or even the discarded inaugural, and see what the agenda was, the question we're asking ourselves was, how consistently did he pursue that agenda? And as many of you are now observing, he did it quite consistently. He didn't give up on saying, let's make sure we get the postal system up and working, and remember that the purpose of it is to foster communication among the citizens, getting the news, the political news, moving back and forth. So that what we can see is the agenda is what's developing. When we ask what's consistent, he is pushing the agenda even while dealing with contingencies, the issues that come up from time to time. One area where I would really invite you to pay close attention is to the way in which he talks about the problem with Indian tribes. Remember, it begins with the problems in the west-northwest. Then subsequently emerged problems with Creeks, Chickamaugas, and Cherokees in the south and southwest. But throughout his discussion is always very careful to emphasize we want to protect our frontiers, but we also want to build appropriate relationships with the tribes. We want to offer whatever inducements we can to the fostering of growth and civilization, but we also want to foster good relations back and forth. He constantly says, treat them with fairness, with justice, with moderation, build their confidence. He doesn't simply say, let's go out and get revenge for some of the depredations that have been experienced. In fact, he never says that. What he does is try to foster a form of interaction that is itself a way of emphasizing the tone and character of the government that is being constructed. Now, when we are looking at these policy issues, I think you can see there's a certain tendency and direction of them, which is also reflective of the discussion of education. Washington believes fundamentally that there is a kind of national prosperity that we're driving toward, which is a reinforcement of the bases of character that are necessary to make the nation successful. And this is a question we haven't raised yet, but one we must put on the table, particularly as we're moving now towards the farewell address. And we do want to have some time to think about that farewell address. But that issue that's laid on the table is, what does prosperity mean? Let's put it that way. We can figure out what it means from reading the Federalist Papers. But what does Washington mean when he constantly alludes to this prosperity as the goal? It seems to me that the flourishing state, remember he made that statement in the discarded inaugural, that he has a vision of a flourishing state. The flourishing state is one not only in which people's material needs are provided through their efforts, but one in which they also flourish intellectually and morally. And so the agenda that's being advanced through these issues is an agenda that is meant to bring all these things together, to concatenate, if I can put it that way, these separate lines of development towards the eventual assessment that we have accomplished a flourishing state. Now, Tony Williams just made a wonderful observation that is also the basis of the 1783 circular letter. And that's precisely the point, that Washington seems to work very consistently in a certain direction. And that direction he articulated early. Now, let me harp on this for a moment, because it's really important for us to understand something. The question is Washington reacting, or is Washington setting direction? I think what we have to do, if we're going to be candid, is acknowledge that Washington is setting direction. There's always going to be some reaction in government. For example, when the Directory emerges in France in the middle of their revolution in 1793, there's need to react. There is a French minister in the United States who's very problematic and causes a great deal of trouble for Washington. He needs to react to that. There are threats that require reaction. But what he's doing is not merely reacting or running from crisis to crisis, as we may put it. He is rather setting direction and tone, getting us beyond merely reacting to crises, or, as he will say in the farewell, making us strong enough that we can handle reactions from our internal resources while still keeping our focus on our global view, or the mission, as the mission has been defined. When I say, therefore, that Washington is directing, what I'm suggesting is he has long had a certain goal in view, and he's pursuing that goal. Now, at the beginning of the farewell address, you will perhaps remember this. You can, this gets out of order, but might as well turn and look at it just so I can emphasize it for you for a moment. He says the most extraordinary thing at the beginning of that address. Let's see if we can find it quickly enough. My pages are, here we are. It's not underlined here, so I'm going to have to find it for you. But he's explaining why he's not going to run again. And he indicates that he has spent some 45 years in the service of his country. And for whatever reason, the exact passage isn't jumping out at me now. As I say, it's not underlined. And so I'm going to let it go, let you take my word for it. But when one of you finds it, then you can signal us where to look for it. But he said, I spent 45 years working for my country. And that gives us pause, right? Because the 45 years, when you calculate back from September 1796, takes you back to 1751. It's an extraordinary claim. It's a claim that could hardly be accredited. What does it mean to say that he's been doing this since 1751? Well, we know, of course, he fought in the Virginia militia in the issues leading up to what became the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. But there, of course, he was in the Virginia militia, and he was working with the British Army at some point. Certainly, toward the 7 Years' War, was cooperating with the British Army. What does it mean that this work, from which he's now retiring, has lasted for 45 years? It seems to me that what Washington is telling us is that his understanding of the work that he's been doing at the end of the founding is consistent with what he was doing at the beginning. That the views he has perceived are views that continue to be developed, articulated, and consistently advanced as a single mission, such that his founding work covers his entire adult life for all practical purposes. He knew what he was doing. And therefore, to that extent, knowing what he was doing, he has effectively placed the country in the position to come to the proper understanding of what the founding is about. And Kate Patron has identified it, as well as Jason Ross, page 527, so you can all find it there. I hope you're all seeing that, where he says 45 years. So he's given the country the ability to see what it's about. But that means he's also claiming to have provided direction. You see, there's no one else in the entire founding period who could speak that comprehensively of having been engaged in the founding in the way that Washington has done. So that means that we're looking through these messages and asking, what's consistent? What tracks through them? How does the agenda develop and grow? And how does his handling of it reflect what we might call a sustained mission? It's in that light that we want to ask that question. That's why I posed the question. Now, let's just go back a bit before I'm going to run out of time if I don't move more quickly. But before taking up the farewell itself, which I want you to have some time thinking about, so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes on this. I want you to go back to think about the fourth annual message in 1792, the one in which I told you he begins the motion towards the 1794 address, where he attacks self-created democratic societies. He begins there to emphasize certain things. And what he's concerned with, as he says at page 485, the results of your common deliberations will, I trust, be productive of solid and durable advantages to our constituents, such as by conciliating more and more their ultimate suffrage will tend to strengthen and confirm their attachment to that constitutional government upon which, under divine providence, materially depend their union, their safety, and their happiness. That's probably the best summary in all of Washington's writing of what the project is about. This is a reflection of what the whole farewell address is devoted to discussing. That single passage at the bottom of page 485. The constituents are the people. Their suffrages are what will sustain the Union. But their attachment to the Constitution, you see, is not merely the vote that's important. It's the vote informed by attachment to the Constitution that works the magic that Washington is trying to make. How to make this clear to you? Look at what's happening in Egypt presently. The people voted. They elected a government, or at least a president. They elected a parliament too, but it has been under some difficulty sitting. They're now again rioting because unhappy with the consequences. They're considering a constitution, but some don't want to consider it. But the point is, the vote as an abstraction is of no value. The vote gains its value in the context of deliberative procedures well established to which the people are attached. You can't call something democracy simply because it is occasioned by a vote. This is what Washington is emphasizing. So what we're trying to do is build what we might call a set of interrelated, interlocking dynamics. The dynamics of participation, democratic participation, the dynamics of rule of law, the dynamics of self-discipline, the dynamics of constitutional order. And when they all work together, then we are, in fact, particularly advantaged by the objectives that Washington has sought. So bearing that in mind, and then proceeding through the rest of the addresses, which I'm going to, lead to your attention, because I don't have time to talk about them, all that they mean in terms of our walking tour. But what I want you to do is to consider in the 6th annual message, the one delivered in November of 1794, the manner in which what Washington has to do is to deal with perhaps the most difficult period in his presidency, perhaps second only to the debate over the Jay Treaty, and that's the handling of the Whiskey Rebellion. And notice, he had in the previous year, which we're not going to go through, begun setting forth a process for trying to pacify Western Pennsylvania. And he bends over backwards to say we're going to proceed with moderation, we're going to proceed with clemency, but we're going to insist upon the rule of law. And so in critiquing the self-created democratic societies in that context, what Washington is suggesting to us is that only regular order, fully embraced as constitutional order, can fulfill the vision that inspired the development of the Constitution. So that anything that happens outside of regular order, whether it is an expression of popular opinion or not, is inconsistent with the constitutional purpose and vision. So hold that thought, bear that in mind, realize that we get through all the messages and we're going to skip all the rest of them. The one that comes in December of '96 is important in many significant ways, but I'll pause just long enough to actually look at page 509 in that, skipping over 508, which is also important, where he's talking about, having proposed a national university. So I'm coming back to the educational theme. Amongst the motives to such an institution, the assimilation of principles, opinions, and manners of our country by the common education of a portion of our youth from every quarter well deserves attention. The more homogeneous our citizens can be made in these particulars, the greater will be our prospect of permanent union. And a primary office of such a national institution should be the education of our youth in the science of government. It goes on, of course. What is my point? My point is he underscores the homogeneity, the growing homogeneity of the society, the permanence of the union. And he wants, therefore, to let us appreciate the value of the republicanism, or it's fair to say the democracy. We don't have to be such sticklers about that distinction, in the way that he underscores in the next page, where he says the effect of this education is to make people eligible for office independent of wealth. You will see in the next to last paragraph on page 510, it would be repugnant to the vital principles of our government virtually to exclude from public trust talent and virtue unless accompanied by wealth. So this homogeneity he's aiming at is one that needs to surface, just as Thomas Jefferson has expressed it, all the talent and all the virtue without regard to the limitations of material conditions. So having said that, and remembering that he delivered that address after he delivered the farewell address, that comes first in the order presented in this book, we then want to turn to the farewell address, which I don't have time to develop fully for you, but I certainly will commend to you the chapter in my book, George Washington, America's First Progressive, the chapter George Washington Statesman, which is a very detailed analysis of this farewell address. Now, coming back then to that statement I made before about his 45 years, at the outset of this address, what we're looking at is Washington's statement of what the work has been about, what the 45 years has been all about. And he says, of course, he's grateful to this country for having given him the occasion to serve and for having expressed itself happy with the service. But he's mainly concerned about the future. How to put this? George Washington, in his farewell address, is not going to dwell over long on self-congratulation. He's mainly concerned to continue teaching. Someone in the chat made the observation earlier that leaders educate the public. Washington talking about education means calling on us to establish formal modes to foster community through education. But also, he's educating the community by making those very claims. They're not merely speeches. Remember, Washington has never been remembered as an orator. He was perhaps somewhat hesitant of speech. He presented his views mainly in writing, as he did the farewell address. He didn't deliver this address from a podium. He submitted it and had it published in a newspaper. This goes back to the very beginning of his career, when Washington discovered in the conditions under which the Revolutionary War was fought, that he quickly saw that his correspondence would often be commandeered, whether by the enemy or others. They would always read it, and it would always end up being published, whether he intended that or not. And so he quickly began to adapt and even use his correspondence as opportunities to publish things tacitly, which would then get public notice. So he's always addressed the public in writing mainly, and not verbally or by audible expression. So the farewell address is such a contribution focused on the future and now meant to characterize how the people should conduct themselves leading into the future. The characterization he gives us is meant to show how to preserve what he calls the liberty we very highly prize. Those are the words he uses in the address. But that liberty is now wedded to something else that we highly prize, because he says the people now love being one people. The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you, he says. And the work of the founding was precisely to create that particular dearness, that the dearness of liberty was intrinsic and natural and there from the beginning. But to understand that the preservation of liberty required to development a dearness of union, that took political construction. That was not intuitive to anyone. Intuitively, liberty is consistent with anarchy. There's no reason to think any one person's liberty depends on someone else's liberty per se. Washington recognized the flaw in that line of reasoning and recognized that no one who had an appreciation for liberty could meaningfully advance the cause of liberty unless they could develop a political construct which in itself would be the basis to sustain liberty. So that meant a national union, what he referred to in the circular address in 1783 as a national character. He said there, we have a national character to establish. He's celebrating the establishment of the national character in the farewell address. That's what it's about. George Washington is making clear. I wish I could do the details for you, but time will not permit me to say all that needs to be said, and it's too detailed for me to develop it in a slight way. So I'm just not going to try to do so at all. I know that you are familiar with the normal lines about religion and morality. You're familiar with the passage on education, and you're familiar with the passage on avoiding entanglements with foreign nations. But Looking at the whole, what we've gotten here is a blueprint for successful statecraft in the United States. At the bottom of it, you will see is a claim that if the United States grows strong enough, which means keeps itself out of trouble long enough to build its strength, that it can act independently of the world, and if it acts always with justice, there's no reason to think that it cannot preserve itself into an indefinite future. That's the thrust of the farewell address. In other words, he encapsulates the agenda we've been talking about that builds through these annual addresses, and then shows what the outcome of it will be, not just for his time, but for a long time to come. That's the purpose of the farewell address. So what we have here is a clearly enunciated political agenda, and we're in a position to make an assessment of it. We can say, did this work? Was it true? Was his ambitious agenda one that was fulfilled? And let me warn you, the fact that we're still here over 200 years later does not mean that the agenda was fulfilled, because we would also have to identify the extent to which we continue to live in adherence with the pattern that Washington sought to set as a precedent. His resignation, you know, was itself a precedent. It created the precedent of a two-term presidency, which lasted until Franklin Delano Roosevelt came along. So a powerful precedent. But it wasn't the only precedent. However, I would say the most important of all the precedents that Washington created was precisely this precedent of giving voice to a goal for Republican life itself. Not mere policies here and there, not mere reactions to particular crises or urgencies, but giving voice to the idea of self-government and of a people who are a self-governing people attached to the union that sustained them in that. That was the most powerful precedent. So much so that it remains largely for us the food that we live on in that regard. Yet, Abraham Lincoln recaptured it in important ways and beautifully, of course, at Gettysburg. But in terms of the full-throated expression of the ideal, it was Washington that enunciated it. We've had people who crept up to it or attempted to. Woodrow Wilson comes to mind. Theodore Roosevelt comes to mind in some ways. But who also, of course, departed so far from the full expression that Washington gave that they never actually achieved in their comments the goal that Washington had in mind. So we are either still such a political association as Washington articulated, or Washington is a historical footnote, beautiful to observe and pay attention to, but otherwise not relevant to American politics. And that's the question we're going to have to ask. It's the question I'm going to leave you with. There are a couple of minutes if anyone wants to take a stab at commenting on it, but I realize that I have been terrible this morning. I have exhausted us without getting to the meat of the argument. I'm just going to have to do better at timing in the future. You've got to remember to get the punchline in at the right moment. Are there any questions?
Professor Allen, you've been fantastic today. We're grateful to have had you here. And I think that the discussion and the comments that you've made about George Washington's leadership and the kinds of citizens that he hoped to educate us to be have been very helpful. We do have time for maybe one or two more questions or comments from our participants, if there are any who want to comment. I see people in the chat window saying that they've enjoyed the presentation, that this has been marvelous. Are there any more comments from the participants? If so, please raise your hand. Well, it looks like we have Jason Nelson. Do you want to give a final comment, Jason?
I'm not hearing you yet.
Jason, if you want to click on your microphone, and there you go.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
What would Washington think about the political process today, in your opinion?
You know, I meant to get through this without any partisan suggestions on my part. But I have to be honest with you and tell you that I have, from the beginning of the present administration, been surprised, astounded by the extent to which the president was so committed to first-person usage. And happily, I can say that he has disciplined himself, and in the past year has begun to diminish that significantly. But it seems to me that as George Washington observed that, he might have been a bit horrified. He had to make a deliberate decision not to do it himself. And he would have hoped that everyone would see the wisdom of doing that. So I think that would be his reaction to our contemporary politics.
I think that will have to be our final word for today. Once again, thank you for being with us today, Professor Allen. And to our participants, as you leave, I want to make you aware of just a few opportunities that the Ashbrook Center has available for you. If you enjoyed this kind of interaction with Professor Allen, I hope you'll take a look at our live online courses in American history and government. Professor Allen has been one of our faculty in our live online graduate courses. We offer a series of live online seminars. We use this WebEx platform. You will be able to see and hear and converse with your professor and fellow students. All courses are capped at 16, so you do have the chance to build a real conversation and extend that conversation over the course of your 8 weeks together in each class. Successful completion of each class will earn you 2 graduate credits from Ashland University. Please take a look at our website, teachingamericanhistory.org, for more information. Also, if you are interested in having a webinar of this kind in your classroom for your students, we do have student webinars available. Visit our website, teachingamericanhistory.org/webinars. And there you can find more information about how to request a webinar in your classroom for your students. As you leave, as you exit the training center, you should be redirected to a survey. We would be grateful for your feedback and comments about this webinar and our series of live online Saturday seminars. Also, if you complete this survey, please include your mailing address, and with that mailing address, we will send you a letter to document your participation in today's seminar. So thank you all again very much for being with us today, and once again, thank you, Professor Allen, for your time today. Thank you, and you're now dismissed.